I've often said this, how much I'd love to, and I know it'd be bizarre and probably very uncomfortable. And but they say you never meet your heroes. I'd love to meet Paula Meehan. And I definitely wouldn't like to meet her and sit down and have a conversation about literature. Because for a start, I think I don't know anything about her other than what I learned from reading her poetry. But I'd say she has a very low level for pretentiousness, the kind of pretentious nonsense that discussions about literature kind of elicit. But I just love to love to meet her and say thank you. Is that sad? Probably is. Because I think she's a really important poet. And this poem, Jesus, it spoke to me. I'm from a place called Neilstown, which is in North Clondalkin. And it's a place where I grew up, and great community in the estate I lived in called Rolla. But it was definitely a place like back in the 80s. Don't live there anymore, so can't comment on what it is like now. But back in the 80s, it was a place of socio-economic deprivation. Now, I didn't know that at the time, just where he lived. And it was, as I say, a fucking fantastic community on Air Road and people supporting each other and all that. But I do remember, I didn't go to school there. And I do remember feeling like where I did go to school that I was kind of slightly lesser because I lived there. There was nothing kind of explicit, but you were from there. And when I read this poem first years ago, I remember thinking, bloody hell, I know what she means. Now, the difference between me and Paula Meehan is that she's a she's a brilliantly talented and gifted writer who can take that experience and turn it into something like this. I can't. I can only appreciate it. So this is the exact moment I became a poet by Paula Meehan. It describes, well, it's really quite easy to read. It's accessible. One of the things I like about Meehan's poetry is that it is profoundly accessible and easy to read. Now, the fact that it is doesn't mean that it's like, it's not to trivialize it. There's depth and meaning here, be it below the surface. But it's a narrative. It's a narrative where it's a memory poem. And basically what she says is, I was in school one day when I was a kid, and the teacher passed a comment. And the teacher, the comment was hurtful and insulting, but the teacher's insult was accurate. That's what I think she'd take. And again, if I ever do get to buy Paula Meehan that coffee or that glass of wine, I think, and I'm happy for her to tell me I'm full of shit. I think the reference to Kay Foran, the fact that the poem is dedicated to Kay Foran is really important. Kay Foran is, she's from the North Inner City, and she's a woman whose life story, Google her. She's a woman whose life story is fascinating because it's about how education, if you're working class or if you're from, an area where there's socioeconomic difficulty, education when you're young is often not for you. And Kay Foran left school early and went off to work. But in her kind of later, in her middle ages, I'm in my 50s, when she was in her late 30s, early 40s, she went back to education and she became an advocate for education. I think particularly for women who maybe had, like her, left education when they were young. So the poem has this message about the importance of education, I think. And I think that knowing the dedication really reinforces that sense. Let's have a quick look. So first thing I love about it is that the title rolls in to the first line. And so you read it from the title. The exact moment I became a poet was in 1963 when Miss Shannon, rapping the duster on the easel's peg, half obscured by a cloud of chalk, said, "Attend to your books, girls, or mark my words, you'll end up in the sewing factory." Love that little piece of dialogue. I love the onomatopoeia of rapping because it kind of stimulates the oral sense and suddenly does that thing, brings you into the world being described. So we have the oral senses appeal to. The note that she was by banging the board. I've done this myself back in the day. You bang a board with a duster back when we had chalk in classrooms, and the fucking dust would lift up. The dust of 20 years. I remember one day I was messing around in class and I punched the board, making a point forcefully, and next minute I just disappeared in a cloud of chalk dust. But anyway, we can see Miss Shannon. We can hear her, first of all, rapping the board. And then we can see this kind of cloud of dust around her. So you have the onomatopoeia appeals to the oral sense. And the dust image appeals to the visual sense. And straight away then you're there. In that first line of the poem, Meehan has succeeded in bringing you out of wherever you were when you read the poem into that classroom. It's 1963. That's the teacher. That's the sound you can hear. That's what you can look at. And I do think, by the way, I'll come back to it, that the teacher disappearing into a cloud of dust is of metaphorical significance as well. Although, again, Paula, tell me I'm talking shit. I'm happy to hear it. So she says this thing, attend to your books. Now, attend to your books means study. Work hard in school. Now, if you attend to your books, what do you become? You become educated. So that's a good message, right? That's a good message to study, because education is of value. You know, I think we've completely lost in Ireland. I'm not going on a rant, but I think we've completely lost the value of education. It's become a points race and all about money and economic necessity. And I know those things are really important. But what's wrong with being an educated person? What's wrong with education for the sake of education? Surely that's valuable. But anyway, so she says, attend to your books, which is grand. But then she says, if you don't, mark my words, listen to me, you'll end up in the sewing factory. Now, so the sewing factory is clearly a place you don't want to end up. The use of the colloquial phrase end up suggests failure. The use of the colloquial phrase end up suggests that people who are in the sewing factory are not valuable, that they're like somehow substandard. Now, the point the teacher is making is like, it's a serious point. The sewing factory, if you're working there, it's hard work, it's drudgery, and you don't get paid much, and there's no ladder, to improve. You can't. It's not a career. It's a job. And what the teacher is saying is nobody wants to live like that. That's tough. That's hard. But of course, that's from the teacher's perspective. She's middle class. And the idea of working in a sewing factory is a sense of like you've failed in life. But when the poet hears those words, she has a more nuanced reaction. She's insulted. I would say that I've worked with great teachers over the last 30 years. I've worked with great teachers. But I still think that the best teacher I've ever encountered in my life was a teacher I had in secondary school. And I remember things that she said. Like, I'm old now. And I remember things that she said that just seared into me like a tattoo. In a way that very few people I've ever met in my life have said things, positive and negative. I mean, just an outstanding human being, this teacher was. I won't say her name. You know who you are. Um, but what teachers say does have an impact. And it had an impact on the young Paula Meehan. And she explains to us, it wasn't just that some of the girls' mothers worked in the sewing factory, or even that my own aunt did, and many neighbours. Now look at this, like we got mothers, her aunt, neighbours, but that those words end up robbed the labour of its dignity. So the poet saying that at that moment, that exact moment, she became conscious of the power of words. That those words robbed the labour of its dignity. In other words, it was hard work. And the people working at sewing factory, her aunt, the mothers of her classmates, people living in her community, they worked hard and their work should be respected. But to say end up means that, takes away that. She says it robbed the labour. And robbery is a crime. It's a breach of the social contract. It's wrong. So at that moment, the poet became aware of the power of words and became aware of the power that words had to affect people. And that was the exact moment she became a poet. She says, not that I knew it then, though again, she's reflecting. There's a reflective tone here. She's an older person looking back. Not in those words, labour, dignity. Those weren't words that were in her lexicon when she was a child. That's all back construction. She says, that's me looking back on it. Making sense. Allowing also, the teacher, she says, was right. And this is the bit. This is my favourite line in the poem. The teacher, well, is it because I'm a teacher? It's my favourite line. It's not. That's not why. Also allowing, the teacher was right. And no one knows it like I do myself. Now look at the language there. No one knows it like I do myself. So we have 8 words and 9 syllables. The language is monosyllabic. She is deliberately, this is a very sophisticated writer, Paula Meehan, but she's deliberately here. The teacher was right. And no one knows it like I do myself. The language is stark and direct. Meaning is clear. There's no room for ambiguity here. And that's the difficult thing for her when she writes the poem. That duality. I've been making all the Othello videos, and I keep on coming back to the idea of cognitive dissonance, that two things that can be true, two things that appear to be in contradiction of each other can be true at the same time. Othello is a hero, but he's also someone that we don't admire. The very idea of a tragic hero is an example of cognitive dissonance. But here we have her saying, she at the same time as she was conscious of the snobbery and the elitism and the degradation of the attitude of the teacher, she's also aware of the fact that the teacher was right. That education was the route, is the route to a better life, and that Meehan has pursued that route and has a better life than she would have had she not followed education and had she ended up in a kind of low paid job like working in the sewing factory. So she's expressing in the poem her awareness at that moment, not that it's all back construction, she's all looking back, her awareness of the complexity of life, that things aren't simple, and the power of words, and the impact of a teacher, and the importance of education. All of those things. Remember I said this poem was easy? Remember I said there's loads under the surface? This is why I would love to meet This is why I'd love to meet Paula Meehan and just to say thank you. Like, this poem is entertaining. You watch a movie and do you go back and watch it again? Sometimes you do. Like I've watched The Sopranos multiple times. It's like modern day Shakespeare. I've read King Lear in particular. It's my favourite book. I don't know how many times I've read King Lear. Every time I go back to The Sopranos, I always find something new, and I always find it interesting, and I always marvel at the putting together of it. And the same thing with Shakespeare, and I think the same thing with this poem. There's very few poems I feel like that about. Now I do read a lot of poetry, and I do love. I'm probably too positive about poetry. I'm probably not critical enough, but I just like I have no talent, so I admire people with talent, and boy does Paula Meehan have it. Anyway, let's finish this. But I saw them, mothers, aunts, and neighbours, trussed like chickens on a conveyor belt. That's the famous simile from the poem. The conveyor belt, of course, an allusion to the work in a factory, but more to do with the social conditioning of women. The trust like chickens, like an image of being helpless. Women born into working class backgrounds, having very little opportunity, being kind of powerless to dictate the direction of their lives. All of that is there. Getting sewn up the way my granny sewed the sage and onion stuffing in the birds. A gorgeous image of the domestic work, what was expected of women then. Not to say she's not knocking that work. She's celebrating it really in that image of her granny's skill. But she's talking, she's thinking about ideas of attitudes to gender and gender stereotyping and all that stuff. And then the end of the poem. And the end of the poem, like if I'm studying this poem, if I'm you and I'm studying this poem, I'm learning that. Sorry, now annoying myself there. I'm learning that, and I'm learning this. She learned at that moment, the exact moment she became a poet, that words could pluck you, leave you naked, your lovely shiny feathers all gone. And I know what that feels like. I think most people listening to this video will know what that feels like. How words can devastate. And they are powerful. And they can leave somebody feeling utterly exposed. The chicken with all its feathers plucked off, truss tied up, being processed, eaten up and thrown away. That's the image that she has there. So she understands the power of words, and she understands how disempowering, hurtful, and thoughtless words can be. So again, I don't think she writes the poem to condemn Miss Shannon at all. I don't think she writes the poem as a polemical about being working class and, an attack on the middle classes and the man, I think she writes the poem because it's about how complex life is. I think she writes the poem because she's thinking about the connection between the past and the present. I think she writes the poem because she's a poet who's aware of the power of words. And I think she's writing the poem because she's a deep, deep, deep empathy with people who find themselves trussed up like chickens, plucked of their lovely shiny feathers, utterly vulnerable and unable to defend themselves. I think it's a brilliant poem. The Exact Moment I Became a Poet by Paula Meehan.